Welcome back to the second part of the video lessons on histogram. This time we are going to construct our own histogram. Last video, if you're unsure, we did the interpreting of a histogram and started to find out what was important and necessary. A couple of things, if you remember, that you can get started on right away when you're making your own histogram is always up the left side was the word frequency. And that's because that represented how often something occurred. And here it looks like we're looking at basketball players' heights. And so when we end up making our classes, it will be how many basketball players have a height within that class range. Now, general rule of thumb is you always start your frequency at 0. And so long as you count up to half as many values as you have, your frequency should be labeled properly. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 basketball players' heights. And so half of 12 is 6. And so again, general rule of thumb is if I count up to half as many values as I do, and so now because I know I only have to count up to 6, I'm going to count by ones. I'm trying to make that look as large as possible so it's easily read. I'm going to count by ones up to 6. Labeling the next axes would be what we're looking at. We're looking at heights, so I'm going to put heights, and it's going to be in inches, as you see up there next to our table. So this is in inches. And then you might as well give your histogram a title as well, and I'm just going to call it Basketball Players' Heights. Alright, if you remember from last video, the most important thing and one of the defining features of a histogram is the class width. A lot of times if you are to construct your own histogram, you will be given the class width. Here you see the class width is 3. The class width, remember, is just how wide each class is. Now, when you start to make your classes, you don't have to start at 0 because I would have tons of classes. And just like the general rule of thumb for frequency was to count up to half as many values, there's a general rule of thumb when making your classes. You should always have about 4 to 6 classes. And that's how a lot of these class widths get determined. So this was predetermined for you, meaning I need a class width of 3. If you look, this information is organized, which is really helpful. 64 being my lowest value, 76 being my highest. So I need to span from 64 to 76. And if you remember, the most important thing, the trickiest thing from interpreting a histogram is when I start to make my classes with a parenthesis, some number, and a bracket, that parenthesis meant that I would not include that number. So if I started with 64, I wouldn't properly be able to represent that number. So I'm actually going to start with the lowest number possible that would allow me to include 64. So I'm going to put a 63 down here. And then if it's a class width of 3, add 3 to that, and that means I'm going to go from 63 to 66. And then when you start to make your histograms, each class you progress on, the first number is the last number from the previous class. So I'm going to start with 66 again. That's because, remember, one last time here, the 66 is included. That bracket means I'm going to include 66. So these two players who have a height of 66 are going to be included in the class represented by heights 63 to 66. Over here is going to go 66 to 69, then 69 to 72, and I need to make as many classes until I include that last number. 72 to 75, unfortunately, that means I'm going to need one more class because I need to get to 76. So I can't just write 75 to 76, I need to continue going at that class width of 3. So I'm going to make that last class 75 to 78. And now comes the easier and much more fun part. You just need to count and place your values in the appropriate class. So this is all numbers 63 to 66. That would be 1, 2, 3. So this class is going to have a height of 3. And notice where I'm going with this. I'm going to go all the way over to about halfway in between my writing down here, because remember also from last video, in a histogram there is no space in between those bars. Then this includes all numbers 66 to 69, except I'm not going to include those 66s here because of that parenthesis. So actually only one number there. So that class has a height of 1. 69 to 72 would include 70, 71, 72. So another class with a height of 3. 72 to 75, not including 72. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 in that there. So I have 4 in my 4th class. And then my final class, remember how we just needed to go one more for that 76. So there's one person in the final class there with a height of 76. Now, that would be an appropriate final answer, but some people do like to have little numbers above each class so that it's even easier to read for someone trying to interpret theirs. And it would also be a nice double check. 1 plus 4 is 5, 8, 9, 12. Just like we said, there were 12 people, and so there's your histogram for basketball players' heights. Let's do one more. Here's a histogram, and we have SAT scores. And if you look again, the most important part down here, we have a class width. We want it to be 100. And that makes sense because my scores span from 960 all the way to 1550. And if you know, on a 2-part SAT, scores would range from 400 to 1600. So all of these numbers make sense. Again, I'm going to start out with the easiest thing. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to write frequency up the left side. And then remember, you should count and include about half as many values. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22 values. So I've got to count up to at least 11. I think I'm going to count by 2s to 12. Because counting by 1s, I might not have enough room. It might end up making my graph just a little too spread out, and I want it to be as large as possible. Then across the bottom, I'm going to represent what we're looking at. These are scores. And I'll get back to the class width last, because that's usually one of the harder parts, but a title, appropriate title could be SAT scores. And we don't know whose scores these are, so we'll just leave it at that. And now we're ready to make our classes. Again, class width being 100 means I'm going to have certain classes here written across the bottom that span 100 points. I need to at least include my lowest value. And you can see these are kind of organized, but certainly no values less than 960. And it does look like 1550 is my highest. So I've got to span from 960 to 1550. Which means I think I could start at 950 and count by 100, because 950, 1050, 11, 12, 13, 14. My last class could end exactly at 1550, and remember the upper end has the bracket, so I wouldn't be able to include that, so then I would have everything I need. So let's start with 950 to 1050. And it already looks like, because these numbers are so large, it's going to be hard to fit everything on here. So I'm not going to change my class width. I'm just going to try to write a little bit smaller. And you might have to look a little bit closer up here. This is going 1050 to 1150, 1150 to 1250, 1250 to 1350, 1350 to 1450, and then I'm going to have to extend this, and we're going to put one more on here, 1450 to 1550. But by including that last one being a bracket there, by including that 1550, I'll be able to have my last value, and that should work for everything. So now's the easier part. I got to count any number of scores less than 1050. Where there's one of them, that's a 1060, 1080, and the rest are in the 11 or hundreds or greater. So that looks like I just have one. So I'm going to go halfway between 0 and 2, because halfway between 0 to 2 is 1. Then any number that I haven't crossed out up to 1150. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can include 1150, so 6, 7. Any other? Nope. So 7 values go up to 1150. So I have to go all the way up in between 6 and 8. Make my class. And I'm going to go back and put those little numbers above so that we all know. So we had 1, then we had 7. Now I'm going from 1150 to 1250. So 1200 twice. So there's 2. 3. But my next is 1260, and that's too high. So this is going to have a frequency of 3. That means 3 people scored between 1150 and 1250. Then we have 1250 to 1350, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can include that. We're going all the way up here to 6. Then I've got 1350 to 1450, so that's another 2. And then my last class, every other number I've left, 1, 2, 3, make that final bar. And again, we kind of ran out a little bit of room here, but you can see 10, 11, 17, 19, plus 3 is 22, which is as many values as I started with. This histogram would be good to go. One thing I want to note before we finish with this video, if you remember from the first videos where we said when interpreting you couldn't find the mean and mode, and the range and the median weren't super accurate. They were close and they were good estimates when I have no other information, but they weren't exact numbers. Keep in mind, if I have all of the information, which I do here, I would not only be able to make my histogram, but I would be able to find the mean, the median, the mode, and the range from all of these numbers. Alright, join us for our next lesson if you need to watch any more videos.